Getting arrested because of absurd laws is nothing new. Like playing dominoes on a Sunday is illegal in Alabama, but I'm not surprised it's as, well, Alabama. Making faces at a dog in Oklahoma is also illegal. 1. Someone made a weird face at a dog, and 2. Prosecutors had nothing better to do than outlaw it. That being said, our very distant past is also littered with weird laws. Some could get you killed or imprisoned. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Imagine strolling through the Forum in the 2nd century CE. Marble temples gleam in the sun. Merchants haggle over olive oil and garum, and senators glide past in dazzling white togas, each edged by a slender stripe of deep, almost blackish crimson purple called purpura. Now picture a common baker deciding to flaunt that same hue on his cloak. Before nightfall, he could be arrested, fined, even exiled. In Rome, a mere pigment could trigger the full weight of the law. Purple wasn't just any shade. It was the most expensive colorant the ancient world had ever known. Extracted drop by painstaking drop from tens of thousands of Mediterranean sea snails, Tyrian purple, sometimes called imperial or Phoenician purple, smelled terrible, stained everything it touched, and cost an eye-watering 20 to 30 times more than gold by weight. Over centuries, Roman lawmakers wrapped this rare dye in layers of sumptuary regulation, statutes that dictated who could wear what, how much jewelry was permissible, even which fabric suited each social rank. By the late Empire, unauthorized purple became treasonous. You could literally be executed for dressing above your station. Why go to such extremes? Part of the answer lies in economics. Monopolizing a luxury commodity fattened the imperial treasury. Another part is political. Color coded the hierarchy. In a society obsessed with visual markers of status, purple was shorthand for auctoritas, the almost mystical authority of emperors, senators, and high priests. But the story also touches chemistry, Mediterranean trade routes, religious symbolism, and the psychology of conspicuous consumption. Rome weaponized a color, turning cloth into a badge of legitimacy and a litmus test for loyalty. Across the next 10 sections, we'll unspool that tapestry. We'll trace purple's Phoenician origins, watch Roman lawmakers tighten control, peek inside dye workshops that reeked of rotting mollusks, and meet smugglers who risked death to peddle bootleg pigment. By the end, we'll see how Rome's obsession with purple outlived the empire itself, flowing into Byzantine regalia, medieval coronations, and modern graduation robes. Long after the last imperial edict had faded like sun-bleached cloth. Long before Rome flexed its legions, seafaring Phoenicians of the Levantine coast mastered a pungent craft, coaxing dye from murex sea snails. According to legend, the hero Melkart's dog bit into one of these mollusks, staining its mouth a brilliant crimson purple, prompting Tyre's artisans to recreate the hue for royal robes. Myth aside, archaeology confirms vats filled with millions of crushed shells at Tyre, Sidon, and later Carthage, attesting to a labor-intensive industry dating back at least to the 16th century BCE. The chemistry was fiendish. Harvesters collected Murex brandaris, or Murex trunculus, cracked the shells, and removed a tiny hypobranchial gland. The secretion, initially pale, turned green, then blue, and finally deep purple when exposed to light and oxygen. A photochemical miracle. Roughly 10,000 snails yielded a single gram of usable dye. The process produced a stench likened to rancid garlic and rotting fish, so dye pits sat outside city walls, downwind. Phoenician merchants carried wool bolts soaked in this dye across the Mediterranean. Elite consumers, from Persian satraps to Greek aristocrats, paid fortunes for cloth that seemed to shimmer between crimson and violet depending on sunlight. When Rome conquered the Hellenistic East, it inherited both the supply chains and the cultural cachet surrounding purple. Early republicans, wary of monarchic trappings, tolerated small purple trims, clavi, on senatorial togas, but frowned on fully purple garments. Even so, demand grew. By the late Republic, victorious generals like Pompey hosted triumphs flaunting solid purple cloaks, hinting that only extraordinary achievement could justify the color's expense and symbolism. Thus, Rome entered a tug of war between expanding appetite and anxieties about excess. Senators relished purple's prestige, yet feared social envy and moral decay. That tension laid the groundwork for the first sumptuary laws, where a once exotic dye became a litmus test for republican virtue, foreshadowing stricter edicts once emperors seized exclusive rights. Rome's earliest sumptuary statute, the Lex Appia of 215 BCE, targeted wartime extravagance, limiting women's gold jewelry, banning multicolored garments, and restricting purple trim. Though repealed 20 years later, it set a precedent: moral guardianship through wardrobe regulation. Over the next 2 centuries, the Senate passed sporadic laws, Lex Fania, Lex Licinia, curbing banquet costs and luxury fabrics. While enforcement was uneven, these edicts expressed an ideological stance. Ostentatious display threatened civic equality and republican simplicity. Purple lay at the center of this cultural debate. The standard senatorial toga, toga praetexta, bore a modest purple stripe, denoting office without tipping into monarchic pomp. Magistrates could wear broader bands during ceremonies, but full-body purple remained taboo. In 55 BCE, Julius Caesar, no stranger to image management, shocked conservatives by parading in a solid purple cloak during games, signaling quasi-royal ambitions. Cicero complained that such foreign luxury corroded Roman gravitas. Sumptuary zeal intensified as social mobility expanded. Wealthy equestrians or freedmen, flush with commercial profits, craved visual parity with old aristocrats. Purple trims, jewelry, and silk imports from Asia became flashpoints. Senate decrees tried to hold the line, yet black market dyers flourished in back alleys along the Tiber, selling cheaper blends of madder red and indigo to mimic genuine Tyrian hues. Inspectors occasionally raided stalls, confiscating illicit cloth, but the dye's allure only grew. By the dawn of the Principate, Rome's leaders recognized that half measures failed. Augustus, determined to stabilize hierarchy after civil war, folded dress codes into his broader moral reforms, Leges Juliae, linking personal conduct, marriage, and apparel to the health of the state. Purple now transcended fashion. It became a political instrument. Soon, only the princeps would dare don an entirely purple toga. The groundwork was laid for the imperial monopoly that would criminalize unauthorized purple outright. Why outlaw purple rather than simply tax it? The answer lies in staggering costs and lucrative markups. Contemporary writers report Tyrian-dyed silk fetching up to 1,000 denarii per pound, 20 or 30 times a legionary's annual salary. Even wool dyed a duller purpurissum shade could bankrupt lesser nobles. Because production clustered along the Levant and North African coasts, Roman middlemen faced transport risks, piracy, storms, and tariffs at every port. By the 1st century CE, emperors grasped purple's fiscal potential. State agents purchased raw dye at source, stockpiled it, then resold finished cloth to aristocrats at controlled prices, pocketing hefty margins. The monopoly mirrored grain annona, or Egyptian papyrus quotas, a strategic commodity under imperial thumb. Some scholars argue that Tyrian purple underwrote parts of the imperial budget, funding public works and frontier garrisons. The dye's scarcity, meanwhile, buttressed its mystique. If supply ballooned, prices would fall, diluting prestige. Costs weren't purely economic. Large-scale dye works polluted coastlines, killing fish and fouling harbors, problems provincial governors had to manage. By nationalizing the industry, Rome could mitigate local unrest while directing profits to the fiscus. Smugglers, of course, skirted controls. Merchants bribed customs officials at Puteoli or Ostia, sneaking in contraband cloth from Sidon. Imperial edicts threatened confiscation of ships, branding, or forced labor for dye traffickers, but black market flows persisted, testimony to the color's irresistible cachet. Thus, the ban on wearing unauthorized purple wasn't merely sumptuary, it was economic self-interest. Every illegal tunic represented lost revenue and diminished exclusivity. Criminalizing possession simplified enforcement. Seize the garment, question the wearer, trace the supplier. In this way, Rome fused fiscal policy with sartorial surveillance, transforming a snail-based pigment into a pillar of imperial finance. Augustus formalized imperial exclusivity, reserving the solid purple toga picta for triumphal generals, typically himself or trusted kin. Senators retained narrow purple clavi. Equestrians settled for a thinner stripe. Violators risked confiscation or social disgrace. Yet penalties were still civil, not criminal. That changed under Nero, who in 62 CE declared that any non-imperial citizen wearing the color of the gods committed majestas, treason. Dio Cassius recounts merchants executed merely for selling a silk scarf tinted too richly. Subsequent emperors oscillated between leniency and crackdowns, but the trajectory pointed toward monopoly. Under Septimius Severus, late 2nd century, the Imperial Wardrobe Bureau, Genesium, controlled dye distribution. By the 3rd century crisis, emperors used purple as propaganda. Each usurper minted coins showing himself in shimmering robes, asserting legitimacy. Consequently, laws grew draconian. The jurist Ulpian records capital penalties for artisans caught producing Tyrian dye outside state workshops. Diocletian's reforms, late 3rd century, cemented the system. His edict on maximum prices capped purple cloth at astronomical rates, but reiterated death for unauthorized wear. He restructured bureaucracies into comitatenses, court suppliers, and scholae, imperial tailors, with stringent audits. Any governor who failed to stamp out contraband purple risked recall or worse. The color became so entwined with sovereignty that the phrase "born in the purple," porphyrogenitus, later described legitimate Byzantine heirs. Thus, over 3 centuries, purple's legal status hardened from optional luxury to sovereign prerogative. What began as moral policing evolved into an explicit safeguard of imperial identity, so potent that draping oneself in forbidden dye equated to claiming the throne. In effect, Rome weaponized chromatic exclusivity as a litmus test of loyalty. Purple on the wrong shoulders signaled rebellion. Inside a state-controlled dye workshop, say at Puteoli, slaves and freedmen labored amid vats of brine and crushed shells. First, they soaked murex glands in salt, then fermented them for days, generating indigo precursors. Next, workers heated the slurry in lead or bronze cauldrons, skimming off impurities. The mixture turned yellowish green. Only after cloth was dipped and sun exposed did it oxidize into purple. Controlling temperature and pH was crucial. Too hot and the compound degraded. Too cold and binding failed. Different bath times produced a gradient of shades. The deepest, most coveted black purple required multiple dips and perhaps double the snail quota. Cheaper purples used murex trunculus alone. Elite hues blended secret ratios of brandaris and trunculus, or added Balinus species for redder undertones. Dyers guarded recipes like state secrets. Imperial inspectors periodically weighed leftover dye cakes, ensuring none vanished into private hands. After dyeing, cloth headed to imperial tailors, who fashioned garments according to rank. The laticlave, wide-striped senatorial tunic, needed exact stripe widths. Mistakes risked accusation of status fraud. Imperial cloaks were embroidered with gold thread, sometimes inset with pearls. Each finished robe bore a lead seal stamped with the Sacra Vestis Bureau's emblem, certifying authenticity. Anyone caught with unstamped purple risked interrogation. Even laundries fell under scrutiny. Purple garments required special detergents, often human urine, to fix color without fading. Launderers handling imperial robes had to surrender surplus wash water, lest dye be extracted and resold. This cradle-to-grave oversight underscores how the state treated purple as strategic technology, akin to minting coinage or forging weapons. Roman legal texts catalog penalties, confiscation, fines, exile, or death, depending on offense and era. One notorious case involves a senator named Junius Licinius under Caligula, who wore a solid purple cloak at a banquet. Caligula allegedly mocked him before the crowd, then ordered the garment burned and imposed a ruinous fine. Under Nero, 2 knights were executed for purchasing a purple-dipped silk curtain, deemed an affront to imperial dignity. Archaeological papyri from Egypt record lesser punishments. Merchants flogged and banished for selling counterfeit purpura. In 301 CE, Diocletian's price edict lists purple silk at 150,000 denarii per pound, followed by a clause warning of capital punishment for hoarders or black marketers. Later, in 383 CE, the usurper Magnus Maximus executed a provincial governor whose wife wore purple sandals, branding it a treasonous hint at imperial pretension. Penalties extended to symbolism. Coins bearing usurpers in purple were melted, statues with purple-painted cloaks were defaced, even funeral rites faced policing. Families could not shroud corpses in forbidden hues. Yet enforcement varied. Some frontier regions ignored strict codes, letting local elites flaunt muted purples without consequence, until a visiting inspector cracked down, reminding them that color, like coinage, belonged to Caesar. Where monopolies arise, black markets bloom. Artisans experimented with cheaper dyes, madder root, Kermes insect resin, and indigo from India. By layering red over blue, dyers approximated Tyrian tones at a fraction of the cost. These purpura fraudulenta fooled casual eyes, but not experts. The counterfeit lacked Tyrion's iridescent shift. Still, demand soared among aspirational classes. Smugglers ferried genuine dye in hollowed walking sticks or sealed amphorae mislabeled as fish sauce. Coastal patrols seized ships, yet contraband flowed. Some provinces, especially in Gaul, cultivated woad, producing a blue base, later overdyed with red to simulate purple. Legal loopholes emerged. Narrow stripes of such blends skirted bans, letting equestrians mimic senatorial garb. The state responded by expanding prohibitions to any purple-like shade, a linguistic nightmare for prosecutors debating color gradations in court. Interestingly, late Roman manuals detail murex aquaculture experiments in Sicily, an attempt to boost supply and thus lower smuggling incentives. Results were mixed. Snails proved finicky in captivity. As prices stayed high, forgers grew bolder. By the 5th century, some Eastern workshops marketed oxblood purple from lichen, cheap yet vibrant. The color's prestige persisted, but its chemical purity diluted, foreshadowing the monopoly's eventual unraveling. When the Western Empire crumbled, the Eastern court at Constantinople inherited purple's aura. Byzantine emperors adopted the title Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple chamber, and swaddled newborn heirs in porphyry-tiled rooms. Court protocols restricted solid purple silk to the emperor. High officials wore robes with purple panels. Byzantine chronicles tell of envoys awestruck by hallways glowing with purple hangings, a diplomatic theater reinforcing imperial supremacy. The church, meanwhile, co-opted the color. Bishops donned amethyst-tinged vestments. Cardinals eventually adopted scarlet, but papal liturgy retained purple for penitential seasons. Medieval kings echoed Rome. Charlemagne's coronation cloak was Tyrian-dyed, linking Frankish rule to Roman legacy. Over centuries, as genuine murex supplies waned, European dyers embraced orchil lichen and cochineal to replicate the hue. Yet the association with power endured. Even today, purple connotes prestige. University gowns, judicial robes, and royal ceremonies echo Rome's chromatic hierarchy. The pigment's original source, the humble sea snail, has faded from memory, but laws once punishable by death survive as sartorial customs. Thus, Rome's ancient color codes cast a long chromatic shadow across 2 millennia of fashion and authority. By the 6th to 7th centuries CE, several forces eroded Rome's rigid purple monopoly. First, economic strain and territorial loss undercut state dye works. Levantine workshops fell to Persian or Arab control, disrupting supply. Second, new dyes, cheaper yet visually impressive, entered Mediterranean markets, lowering Tyrion's comparative prestige. Third, Christian ideology softened attitudes toward overt luxury, even for emperors promoting humility over opulent display. Imperial edicts still threatened penalties, but enforcement slackened. Provincial elites in Visigothic Spain or Ostrogothic Italy occasionally wore purple-trimmed cloaks without reprisal. By the Carolingian era, Western Europe lacked infrastructure to produce genuine Tyrian purple at scale, making old bands moot. In the East, Byzantium clung to symbolism, but tolerated purple variants for high aristocrats, provided solid imperial purple remained sacrosanct. Eventually, the once lethal color ban morphed into ceremonial etiquette rather than statutory law. Purple survived as a prestige shade, but no medieval monarch executed subjects for wearing it. The dye's biological source dwindled, and sumptuary anxieties shifted to other luxuries: velvet, lace, or gold thread. Rome's chromatic stranglehold faded into legend, yet its cultural imprint persisted in court rituals and heraldry, where purple still whispered of ancient sovereignty. Purple's journey from stinking Levantine dye vats to the exclusive closets of Roman emperors illustrates how a single color can intertwine chemistry, economics, politics, and psychology. In Rome, Tyrian purple's rarity and cost forged a potent symbol, so potent that lawmakers weaponized it, crafting statutes that transformed cloth into a declaration of allegiance. Over centuries, those laws hardened. What began as moral policing evolved into treason statutes, where an unauthorized cloak could invite exile, ruin, even death. The imperial monopoly turned sea snails into state revenue, while the ban itself became a visual firewall protecting the aura of Caesar. Yet the story is equally one of human ingenuity and resistance. Smugglers brewed counterfeit dyes, ambitious courtiers skirted regulations with clever shades, frontier elites flaunted muted purples when inspectors looked away. Ultimately, the system cracked under economic shifts, new dyes, and changing moral climates. But the legacy endured. Byzantium's porphyry chambers, papal vestments, academic hoods, and royal pageantry all echo Rome's ancient chromatic codes. So when we ask why it was illegal to wear purple in ancient Rome, the answer spans far more than a statute. It reveals an empire obsessed with hierarchy, a treasury hungry for luxury taxes, artisans who mastered biochemistry centuries before microscopes, and a populace both awed and intimidated by the power woven into cloth. In Rome, purple was not merely a color. It was an institution, a commodity, a political statement, and a scent of rotting snails wafting through the corridors of power. Long after the last imperial edict faded, the mystique of that forbidden hue still tinges our symbols of authority, reminding us that sometimes the brightest colors cast the darkest shadows.